Ladies and gentlemen, members and guests of the Economic Club of Chicago, it is my great privilege to present Prime Minister Tony Blair, accompanied by Mayor Daly, Philip Rooney, Chairman of the Club. I want you to welcome them.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to this historic evening. Let me begin by recognizing the Ambassador, Sir Christopher Mayer, Consul General, and Mrs. Michael Hodge, and the First Lady of the City of Chicago, Maggie Daly. Let me also express our appreciation to the Prime Minister for taking the time to meet with us here in Chicago and to visit our schools and to see our fine city as he begins his visit to the United States as part of the NATO meeting in Washington commemorating the 50th anniversary of this great alliance. In the past, the Economic Club has had current, former heads of state, from John F. Kennedy to Richard Nixon, share their thoughts with us. And we're looking forward this evening to the Prime Minister's remarks given the dramatic political, economic, and military events occurring in Europe and throughout the world. It's now my privilege to introduce our mayor, who will introduce the Prime Minister. Richard Daly was just elected to his 4th term as mayor of our city. The mayor has earned Chicago an international reputation for educational reform and is a pioneer in crime prevention, gun control, and neighborhood development. The mayor believes the city should be an attractive and people-friendly place, and the proof of his conviction is evident everywhere in this great city. Especially now as spring has come, our city's enjoying the benefits of his love of trees. Everybody knows he loves trees. And we have a few flowers, and also, as he remarked on his way down, he does like the rain periodically because it gets the clean streets even cleaner. So we're doing real well. The mayor has a clear vision for this city. We've seen it work over the last terms of his election. The future of our city is in great hands, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce the mayor of our great city, Richard M. Daly.
Thank you very much. Phil Rooney, Chairman of the Economic Club, Grace Berry, President of the Economic Club of Chicago, Sir Christopher Mayer, UK Ambassador, United States, Michael Hodge, Consul General, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the citizens of Chicago, it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Prime Minister Tony Blair. The United Kingdom has a special place in the hearts of Chicagoans, going back more than 100 years to the Great Chicago Fire. The people of Great Britain responded to this devastating tragedy by presenting Chicago with books and donations to establish a free public library. That legacy lives on today in the impacts of the lives of every man and woman and child in Chicago. It is a tremendous bond between a great nation and a great city. And I've had the privilege as mayor to meet many of the business leaders are here tonight. In making Chicago work, it is because of them. They have set aside their political, philosophical differences on behalf of the people of the city of Chicago. I just want to thank the Economic Club and all the business leaders that have made my job much easier because of your love of this city and what you've accomplished in helping the quality of life of people. So it's my great privilege to introduce to the Economic Club Prime Minister Tony Blair.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And it's a real privilege and honor for me to be here this evening and to address you in this wonderful city of Chicago in this magnificent ballroom here. And my particular thanks to your chairman, Phil Rooney, to your president, Grace Barry, and of course to Mayor Daly as well, a man who I think has now been elected for the 4th time, which for politicians, that's not a bad record at all. You must tell me how you do it. We actually had a marvelous time earlier today in the von Steuben School in Chicago, which then we had a wonderful reception. They were marvelous. I mean, my only slight anxiety was when I read my briefing pack, and it told me that von Steuben was actually a Prussian gentleman whose job it had been to help the American revolutionaries get rid of the British. This is didn't obviously disconcert me at all, but I also, Mayor Daly's wife, Maggie, actually, we got given this beautiful bench as well, this bench which is wonderfully decorated that I've said should go in the garden of Downing Street, and I mean that, and it will. And what's more, all the British press corps actually heard me say it, and, you know. Well, you know what they say about politicians, their promises. So it will be there. It will be there. I was telling them actually at the school about the unusual gifts that I'd got, and that was certainly an unusual one, only equaled by the one that I got in the south of France when I was given by the mayor of the particular town in the south of France where I spent my holidays 2 years ago, a horse, and that was a live horse too. Well, you can never be sure, but it was actually on, I didn't tell them this at von Steuben, Mayor Daly, but it was actually on that occasion that my worst political embarrassment happened, partly because I was so stunned by being given a live horse. I mean, you normally get a clock, you know, clock, a bunch of flowers, you know, but a live horse, no. So I did, Lionel Jospin, whose constituents, who was just nearby, the French Prime Minister, he and I did this live press conference together for French television, and I speak French, but I don't speak it perfectly. But they said, "Oh, come on, you're in France, you're with the French Prime Minister, for goodness sake, speak some French." And we did this press conference live to the French nation, and I was asked the question whether there were any of the policies of Lionel Jospin that I desired to emulate. And I got my syntax a little bit mixed up in French, which is a very, very dangerous thing to do. And I meant to say, I desire to emulate many of the different policies of Lionel Jospin. What I actually told an astonished French nation was that I desired Lionel Jospin in many different positions. Actually, look, in France they're pretty understanding, so but anyway. I promise you, tonight I am only speaking English of a particular British kind. I also am actually delighted to be what I was told earlier, and I believe to be true, that I am the first serving British Prime Minister that has visited Chicago. So, as I said earlier, I don't know what the rest of them did wrong, but I'm delighted to be here. And I'm particularly delighted to be here because of the associations with Chicago that go back a long way between our two countries. We actually set up our consulate here, I think, in 1855, and Marshall Field opened their first overseas buying office in Manchester in 1870. One of Field's shop assistants subsequently opened his own store in London in 1909, and his name was Harry Selfridge. And if you've ever been to Oxford Street in London, you will know the Selfridge's store, so that's another connection between us there. And that sort of interchange goes on today too. Chicagoland is their headquarters of some of Britain's most important inward investors, Motorola, Sara Lee, R.R. Donnelley, and many, many others, nearly half the 124 billion US dollars firms spent on foreign acquisitions last year went on British companies. And we would like it to be even more. Nor is the traffic all one way. British investment in Illinois generates some 46,000 jobs, making us the biggest foreign investor in the state. So there are a lot of ties between this city and my country, and it really is an especial pleasure to be with you here this evening. While we meet here in Chicago this evening, however, there is no point in concealing the fact that terrible things are happening in Europe. Awful crimes that we never thought we would see again have reappeared. Ethnic cleansing, systematic rape, mass murder. I want to speak a little to you tonight about events in Kosovo, but I want to put these events in a wider context, economic, political, and security, because I do not believe Kosovo can be seen in isolation. I hope that no one who has seen what has happened in Kosovo to those refugees can doubt that NATO's military action is justified. Bismarck it was who famously said that the Balkans were not worth the bones of one Pomeranian grenadier. But anyone who has seen the tear-stained faces of the hundreds of thousands of refugees streaming across the borders into Albania and Macedonia, heard their heart-rending tales of cruelty, or contemplated the unknown fate of those left behind, can be in any doubt that Bismarck was wrong. This is, I believe, a just war, based not on any territorial ambitions, but on good, decent values. We cannot let the evil of ethnic cleansing stand. We must not rest until it is reversed. We have learnt twice before in this century that appeasement does not work. If we let an evil dictator range unchallenged, we will have to spill infinitely more blood and more treasure to stop him later. But people want to know not only that we are right to take this action, but also that we have clear objectives and that we are going to succeed. We have 5 objectives, ladies and gentlemen. A verifiable cessation of all combat activities and killings by the Serb forces, the withdrawal of Serb military, police, paramilitary forces from Kosovo, the deployment of an international force, the return of all refugees, unimpeded access for humanitarian aid, and a political framework for Kosovo, building on the accords worked out in France a few weeks ago. We will not negotiate on these aims. Milosevic must accept them. Through the air campaign, we have destroyed already the greater part of Milosevic's operational air force, a quarter of his surface-to-air missile radar systems. The rest do not operate for fear of being destroyed. We've destroyed his oil refineries, the lines of communication into Kosovo, his military infrastructure, including his means of command and communication, and a good part of his ammunition dumps. The morale of the Yugoslav army is beginning to crack. The KLA is now larger and has more support than when Milosevic started his campaign. We have always made clear that this campaign will take time. We will not have succeeded until an international force has entered Kosovo and allowed the refugees to return to their homes. And Milosevic will have no veto on the entry of this international force. Just as I believe there was no alternative to this military action, so I am convinced there is no alternative to continuing it until we succeed. On its 50th anniversary, NATO must prevail. Milosevic may have been convinced that the alliance would fall apart, would disunify. But I am certain that under leadership of your President this weekend, this summit will once again affirm our unity and our total belief and conviction that the aims of NATO must be pursued to a successful conclusion. Success is the only exit strategy I am prepared to consider. We need to begin work now on what comes after that success in Kosovo. We will need a new Marshall Plan for Kosovo, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, and Serbia too, if it turns to democracy. We need a new framework for the security of the whole of the Balkans. And we will need to assist the War Crimes Tribunal in its work to bring to justice those who have committed these appalling crimes. What I wish to do tonight is to take one step back from the immediate events in Kosovo and try and examine those events in a wider context. Because I believe there are important lessons for our countries and our world in this situation and in these times in which we live. 20 years ago, I ventured to suggest to you that we would not have been fighting in Kosovo. We would have turned our backs on it. The fact that we are engaged is the result of a wide range of changes. The end of the Cold War, changing technology, spread of democratic values, but it is bigger than that. I believe the world is changing in a more fundamental way. Globalization has transformed our economies and our working practices, but globalization is not simply economic. It is also a political and a security phenomenon. We live in a world where isolationism has ceased to have a reason to exist. By necessity, we have to cooperate with each other across nations. Now, after World War II, we developed a series of international institutions to cope with the strain of rebuilding a devastated world. Bretton Woods, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union. Even at that time, in the aftermath of the war, it was clear the world was becoming increasingly interdependent. The doctrine of isolationism had been a casualty of the World War, where the United States and others finally realized standing aside was simply not an option. I would argue to you that today the impulse towards interdependence between countries is immeasurably greater. We are witnessing the beginnings of a new doctrine of international community. By this I mean the explicit recognition that today more than ever before, we are mutually dependent, that national interest is to a significant extent governed by international collaboration, and that we need a clear and coherent debate as to the direction of this doctrine as it takes us in each field of international endeavor. Just as within domestic politics, as we can see here in Chicago, the doctrine and notion of community, the belief that partnership and cooperation are essential to advance the individual. Just as that doctrine is coming into its own in domestic politics, so it needs to find its international echo. Global financial markets, the global environment, global security and disarmament issues, none of these, in truth, can be solved today without intense international cooperation. As yet, however, our approach tends towards being ad hoc. There is a global financial crisis. We react. It fades. Our reaction becomes less urgent. Kyoto can stimulate our conscience about environmental degradation, but we need constant reminders all the time to refocus upon it. We are continually fending off the danger of letting wherever CNN roves be the cattle prod to take a global conflict seriously. I believe we need to focus in a serious and sustained way on the principles of the doctrine of international community and on the institutions that can deliver them. This means, I would suggest, the following. One, in global finance, a thorough, far-reaching overhaul and reform of the system of international financial regulation, and we should begin it, as I shall say in a moment, at the G7 at Cologne. Two, a new push on free trade in the World Trade Organization, with the new round beginning in Seattle this autumn. Three, a reconsideration of the role, the workings, the decision-making process of the United Nations, and in particular its Security Council. Four, for NATO, once Kosovo is successfully concluded, a critical examination of the lessons to be learned and the changes, in all honesty, we need to make to organization and to structure. Five, in respect of Kyoto and the environment, far closer working between the main industrial nations and the developing world as to how these targets can be met and the practical measures necessary to slow down and stop global warming. And I would add, sixthly, a serious examination of the issue of third world debt, again beginning at Cologne. In addition to that, the European Union and the United States should prepare to make real step change in our working together. Recent trade disputes have been a bad omen in this regard. We really are failing to see the bigger picture with disputes over the banana regime or hush kits or whatever else it is. Let us face the fact there are huge issues at stake in cooperation between Europe and America today. We need each other, and we need to put that relationship and its strength above arguments that are ultimately not fundamental. Now is the time to begin work in earnest on these issues. I know that your President will stand ready to give a lead on many of them. In Kosovo, but on many other occasions, I've had occasion to be truly thankful that the United States has a President with his vision and his steadfastness. Let me deal with two issues that arise from those list of issues we should focus upon: the economy and security. I guess we would all say that globalization is most obvious in the economic sphere. We live, as you know, in a completely new world. Every day, $1 trillion moves across the foreign exchanges, a lot of it in London. Here in Chicago, the Mercantile Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade make contracts worth more than $1.2 billion per day. It's an extraordinary world, and all the economies have to exist within it. I remember it was just a few months ago that I heard a Latin American finance minister of a new government give a speech in the City of London, where he said that the policies of the previous administration had brought his country to the edge of a precipice, and now was the time for a giant step forward. I've never actually checked to see whether he ever took it. But I think if we're, again, brutally honest with ourselves, the international financial system is not working as it should. The Asian financial crisis of last year, the knock-on impact on Brazil demonstrate that. And we've got to learn the lessons and apply them now. The lesson of the Asian crisis is, above all, in my judgment, that it is better to invest in countries where you have openness, independent central banks, properly functioning financial systems, independent courts, where you do not have to bribe or rely on favors from those in power. We therefore have to consider what reforms are necessary. We have proposed, from Britain's position, that we should make greater transparency the keystone of reform, so that reform goes in the direction not of how we stop international financial flows or trade, but how we make sure it operates within a better, more open, more transparent system. Transparency about individual countries' economic policies through new codes of conduct, transparency about individual companies' financial positions through new internationally agreed accounting standards and a new code of corporate governance that we can apply across the board to give faith in the position in different countries, and greater openness too about IMF and World Bank discussions and policies. We also propose improved financial supervision, both in individual countries through stronger, more effective peer group reviews and internationally through the foundation of the new Financial Stability Forum. And we need, as long as we have the long-term structural reforms in place, we also need more effective ways of resolving crises like those in Brazil. The new contingent credit line at the IMF will assist countries pursuing sensible economic reforms and preventing damaging contagion. But we should also think creatively about how the private sector can help to resolve short-term financial crises. Bob Rubin put forward some ideas on this the other day, so did my own Chancellor Gordon Brown. And the G7 finance ministers will discuss these issues next week. I want to see agreement on the key outstanding questions reached by the Cologne summit. I really believe that we mustn't wait until the next financial crisis happens before we put in place reforms that give confidence and faith in the system for the long term. I would also like to see that summit go further too in the case of Russia. We simply cannot stand back and watch that great and powerful nation teeter on the brink of ruin. Because if it does slide into the abyss, it will affect all of us. A democratic, outward-looking, prosperous Russia is of key importance to us. And we mustn't let even our current differences set us on a route towards the mutual hostility and suspicion that has characterized relations in the past. So I want now to be the time when we are thinking about how we can put the right measures in place to assist Russia. I hope that Russia and the IMF can reach an early agreement on a new program to provide macroeconomic stability, avoid hyperinflation, encourage Russian companies and savers to keep their own money in the country. But this is only a first step. I then would like to see a wider dialogue between Russia and the G7, focusing on all the structural legal reforms that are needed to improve the economic prospects for ordinary Russians. Russia is a unique economy with its own special problems, but also its own unique potential. We all need to build on the lessons of the past few years and develop a long-term strategy for reform that respects Russia's history, her culture, and her aspirations. If Russia is prepared, with our understanding and cooperation, to take the difficult economic action it needs to reform its economy, to build a sound and well-regulated financial system, to restructure, close down the bankrupt enterprises, develop and enforce a clear and fair legal system, and reduce the damage that is caused by nuclear waste, all huge issues for Russia, but also of importance to the entire world, then if that willingness is demonstrated, the G7 must be prepared to think imaginatively about how it can best support these efforts. Again, we will be putting forward concrete ideas on how to do this at the Cologne summit. By opening up our markets to Russian products, by providing technical advice, sharing our expertise with the Russians, and by providing support both bilaterally and through the IMF, the World Bank, other IFIs and the Paris Club for the Russian reform efforts. Again, it's now, even now, perhaps especially now, that we should be considering these issues. Because we will all benefit hugely from a thriving Russia making use of its immense natural resources, its huge internal market, and its talented, well-educated people. Russia's past has been, as a world power, we felt confronted by. We must work with her to make her future as a world power, with whom we cooperate in trust and to mutual benefit. The other big issue on our minds, particularly now, is how we then apply the same sense of globalization, the same sense of principle and direction to international security. And let me say some words on this. We've had now a decade of experience since the end of the Cold War. It has certainly been a less easy time than many hoped in the euphoria that followed the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Our armed forces, indeed, have sometimes been busier than ever. So have the difficulties of the past decade simply been the aftershocks of the end of the Cold War? Will things soon settle down, or does what has happened over these past 10 years represent a pattern that will extend into the future? Many of our problems have been caused by two dangerous and ruthless men, Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic. Both have been prepared to wage vicious campaigns against sections of their own community. As a result of their destructive policies, both have actually brought calamity on their own peoples. Instead of enjoying its oil wealth, Iraq has been reduced to poverty, with political life stultified through fear. Milosevic took over a substantial, ethnically diverse state, well placed to take advantage of new opportunities, and his drive for ethnic concentration and cleansing has left him with a state much smaller, a ruined economy, and soon a totally ruined military machine. As we address these problems of the NATO summit, we may be tempted to think back to what, with all its problems, was the clarity, simplicity almost, of the Cold War. But now I believe we have to establish a new framework. No longer is our existence as states under threat. Now our actions are guided by a more subtle blend of mutual self-interest and moral purpose in defending the values we cherish. What is happening is that we are discovering that in the end, values and interests at a point merge. If we can establish and spread the values of liberty, the rule of law, human rights and an open society, then that is in our national interest too. The spread of our values makes us indeed safer. Does anyone believe that Serbia or Iraq would be nations that originate conflict if they were democracies? As John Kennedy put it, who gave this lecture, as you pointed out, freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, then who is free? The most pressing foreign policy problem we face, therefore, is to identify the circumstances in which we should get actively involved in other people's conflicts. Non-interference has long been considered an important principle of international order, and I do not suggest that we jettison it lightly. But the principle of non-interference must be qualified in important respects. Acts of genocide can never be a purely internal matter. When oppression produces massive flows of refugees which unsettle neighboring countries, then they can properly be described as threats to international peace and security. When regimes are based on minority rule, they lose legitimacy. Look at South Africa. Looking round the world, there are many regimes that are undemocratic, engaged in barbaric acts. If we wanted to right every wrong we see in the modern world, we would do little else than intervene. So how do we decide when and whether to intervene? I would say we need to bear in mind these considerations. First, are we sure of our case? War is an imperfect instrument for righting humanitarian distress, but armed force is sometimes the only way of dealing with dictators. Second, Have we exhausted all diplomatic options? We should give peace every chance, as we did indeed in Kosovo. Third, on the basis of a practical assessment of the situation, are there military operations we can sensibly, prudently undertake? Fourth, are we prepared for the long term? In the past, we talked too much of exit strategies, but having made a commitment, we cannot simply walk away once the fight is over. Better to stay with moderate numbers of troops than return for repeat performances with large numbers. And finally, do we have national interests involved? And I would say again, in relation to the events we witness now, that the mass expulsion of ethnic Albanians from Kosovo demanded the rest of the world to notice. And it does make a difference that it's happening right on the European Union's doorstep in one of the most historically and traditionally combustible parts of the whole of Europe. These aren't absolute tests or considerations, but they are the kind of issues we need to start thinking about in order to develop the proper principles that will govern our actions in future years. And these rules have then to be backed up by reform of the international institutions with which to apply them. If we want a world ruled by law and by international cooperation, we have, I believe, to support the United Nations as its central pillar. But we need to find a new way to make the United Nations and its Security Council work if we are not simply to be returned to the deadlock that undermined the effectiveness of the Security Council during the Cold War. And this should be a task for the members of the Permanent Five to consider once the Kosovo conflict is complete. Ladies and gentlemen, this speech has been dedicated to the cause of internationalism and against isolationism. On Sunday, along with other nations' leaders, including the President, I shall take part in a discussion of political ideas. It is loosely based around what we've called the notion of the third way, an attempt by centre and centre-left governments to redefine a political programme for today's world that is neither old left nor 1980s right. What is interesting to me is that even in the field of politics, ideas are becoming globalized. As problems become global, how to remain competitive, changes in technology, crime, drugs, family breakdown, so the search for solutions becomes global too. What amazes me when I talk to other countries' leaders, literally from any part of the world, is not the differences, but the points in common, the challenges we have in common. We are all coping with these basic same issues. Achieving prosperity in a world of rapid economic and technological change, social stability in the face of changing family and community mores, a role for government in an era where we may have learned big government doesn't work, but where no government works even less. And certain key ideas and principles are emerging, and let me just summarize them for you in my own words and in my own views, because Britain is following them today. It is a different government in Britain, and we are creating a different future for our country. In fact, it's one of the things that often makes it difficult for commentators to define the new Labour government in Britain. We're parodied as either being Mrs. Thatcher with a smile instead of a handbag, or as someone put it, really old-style socialists in drag, desperate to conceal our true identity. I'll leave you to judge which is more insulting. In reality, of course, we're neither. And that's for a very simple reason. And the political class and establishment in all our countries should just be more upfront about it. The truth is, the political debates of the 20th century, the massive ideological battleground between left and right, they're over, those big debates. Echoes remain, but they mislead as much as they illuminate. Let me summarize the new political agenda we stand for, and I think you will notice echoes in your own situation. Financial prudence as the foundation of economic success. In Britain, for example, we have eliminated the massive budget deficit. We've put in a whole series of new fiscal rules. We've granted Bank of England independence, a big thing for us to have done it. And what's more, we're proud of it all. On top of that foundation, we are constructing a new economic role for government. I don't believe in laissez-faire, but the role of government is not picking winners, heavy-handed intervention, old-style corporatism. It is, and I saw an example of this myself earlier today in Chicago, it is about education, skills, technology, small businesses, entrepreneurship. And of these, there's no doubt at all in my mind that education is now recognized as much for its economic as its social necessity. It's been our top priority for our government. It's the top priority here, and I'm sure it's the right one. Third, you will find we are all reforming welfare systems and public services. In Britain, for example, we're introducing measures to tackle failing schools and reform the teaching profession that I was going to say would have been unthinkable by any government a few years ago, but in actual fact, you apparently are doing most of it here in Chicago anyway. Big changes we've put through to our National Health Service. We're very proud of it, but the truth is it needs to change for today's world. And as a result of welfare reform, for the first 2 years of this new government in Britain, welfare bills have actually fallen for the first time in decades. The fourth thing you'll notice is that we are all tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. I think the debate between liberals and hardliners is over. No one can really dispute the causes of crime. In particular, social exclusion, that is a hard core of society that gets shut off from society's mainstream, that lives in a different culture almost from the rest of society. That needs a special focus. Just general economic strength doesn't cure that all of its own. But we don't excuse crime either. Criminals get punished, and we believe that that is justice and fairness too. And then we are all reinventing or reforming government itself. The government machine is being overhauled. Here, your Vice President has led the way. But the whole basis of how we deliver government services is being altered. And for Britain, there's been a very special dimension of this. We're actually altering the basis by which the Constitution of the United Kingdom is governed. We're devolving power to a new Parliament in Scotland over its own local services and a new Assembly in Wales. We've actually just introduced, this is a real innovation for Britain, but it won't seem very innovative to you, we've introduced the concept of elected mayors. I'm still waiting to see how good an idea it really was when I had it. But it's extraordinary, it hasn't existed in the past in Britain, and I think it's going to liven up politics a lot. And we're also changing the way in which Northern Ireland is governed, and I just want to say this to you, because I know this is a city with many Irish connections, that we've made great progress in bringing peace to Northern Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreement that we reached last year was a real breakthrough. We've now got virtually everything sorted out in terms of the constitutional settlement, in terms of the institutions of Northern Ireland, in terms of the relationship between the British and the Irish governments. We've got one hurdle to get over, and it's a difficult hurdle, which is the interplay between the new institutions being set up and all the other provisions of the agreement to do with the renunciation of violence. But I'm determined to find a way through. And I want to thank you all here for all the help you've been, and you, Mayor, and all your colleagues. I'm an optimist by nature, and so I believe we will find a way through. And nothing is more important to me or my government than to be able to conceive of a future in Northern Ireland where no one ever asks or cares whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant or whatever religion you are, but you're all human beings sharing Northern Ireland. So thank you, and thank also your President for all the work that has been done. I have to say, President Clinton has been absolutely stalwart on this all the way throughout, and we really couldn't have come this far without him. But as I keep saying to him, we'll be calling upon him again in the near future. So there are big changes in the UK. And I think for us, probably the biggest decision we face in the next couple of decades will be our relationship with Europe. And here again, there's change. We like to think we have done away with the false proposition that we in Britain have to choose between two diverging paths, the transatlantic relationship or Europe. For the first time in the last 3 decades, we have a government both pro-Europe and pro-American. And I firmly believe that it is in Britain's interests, but also in the interests of the US and of Europe, that we realize stronger in Europe, stronger with the US, and vice versa. That doesn't mean to say we're content with the way Europe is run. We believe it needs radical reform, and I hope we're winning that battle for radical reform and openness within the European Union. Just 2 weeks ago, I issued a joint declaration with the Spanish Prime Minister. Shortly, the new German Chancellor, Schröder, and I will be issuing a declaration also on economic reform. Flexible labour markets, removing regulatory burdens, untying the hands of business if we are to succeed, and making sure that it is not a fortress Europe, but a genuine, open Europe. As to Britain and the euro, the government has put a national changeover plan in place to convert sterling if we decide to do so on the basis of our national economic interests. So Britain and Europe are moving closer together, and our relationship is therefore being transformed. And that brings me back to the very point of my speech to you tonight. The other big change in the people from my political perspective and in my generation has been the embrace not just of different economic and social, and in my case, constitutional policies. It's also been an embrace of internationalism and a rejection of isolationism. And that is an important part of my political philosophy and my political beliefs. This has been a speech that has ranged over many of the most important of those international issues. And I've tried to give you some insight into our thinking about how we can resolve some of the common problems we face. And I think maybe the time is right for that at the moment. But I want to say one final word on the United States itself. You are the most powerful country in the world and the richest. You are a great nation. You have so much to give and to teach the world. And I know you would say, in all modesty, a little to learn from it too, occasionally. And it must be difficult and sometimes irritating to find yourselves the recipient of every demand, to be called upon in every crisis, to be expected always and everywhere to do what needs to be done. The cry, "What's it got to do with us?" must be heard fairly regularly on the lips of your people and be the staple of many a politician running for office. Yet just as with the parable of the individuals and the talents, so those nations which have the power have the responsibility to use it wisely. We need you. We need America engaged. We need the dialogue with you. Europe over time will become stronger and stronger, I believe, but its time is some way off yet. And so I say to you, never fall again for the doctrine of isolationism, because the world truly cannot afford it. Stay, please, a country outward-looking, with the vision and the imagination that is the very best of your nature. And realize too that in doing so, you will have in Britain a friend and an ally that will stand with you, work with you, fashion with you the design of a future built on peace and prosperity for all, which is the only dream that makes humanity worth preserving. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your friendship, for your remarks, for your leadership. For we in America lead the British just as we always have, and we appreciate your friendship and your remarks. And your world leadership certainly has been expressed here tonight to Chicago, to America, and to the world. Thank you very much. At this time, if we could all stay in our seats while the Prime Minister and his party depart for Washington, and if the British press could also leave at this point, we would like to, for security reasons, do that. Thank you again, Prime Minister, for your speech this evening and for being with us.
I thought it was a powerful speech, powerful both in terms of its substance and its delivery.
I was delighted to hear that Europe has an agenda, not only an economical agenda, but political agenda.
As the first serving Prime Minister to visit Chicago, it clearly indicates an awareness on his part that Chicago is a part of the international business community.
I think the message that he delivered is a very important one, and that is the importance of increasing globalization.
What really came across in his speech was his global and dynamic thinking.
It just emphasizes that he's looking for new approaches, and he was looking to Mayor Daly's approach to school reform.
The timeliness was just really right on.
I was very impressed with how Great Britain has always remained one of the staunchest allies of the United States.